Well, good morning, everyone, or good evening, depending on where you're joining us. I want to welcome everybody to our ongoing AVERT webinar series, where we speak to distinguished experts on a wide variety of topics relating to extremism and radicalization and terrorism. This morning, I'm very pleased to have Marc-André Argentino from Canada with us. And I'll introduce myself. My name is Lydia Khalil. I'm the co-convener of the AVERT Research Network. No doubt many of you have joined our webinars in the past, but if this is your first time, welcome. And feel free to go to our website where you can find previous AVERT webinars and also find out more information about our organization. But I know that many of you have a very keen interest in what Marc-André has to present to us and talk to us about. So we'll get straight into that. So first, let me introduce Dr. Argentino. He received his PhD from the Individualized Program at Concordia University in Canada, where he used a mixed methods approach from the Theological Studies, the Center of Engineering and Society, and the Institute of Information Systems Engineering. And his PhD research was on the QAnon movement, doing a survey of the QAnon movement, examining its evolution from a fringe conspiracy theory to a global phenomenon, and how it created novel and different threats to national security and democratic institutions around the globe. His current research still focuses on QAnon, but also in examining primary materials created by violent extremists and terrorist actors, and the way that they interact in the digital environment in order to better understand how we can leverage existing and emerging technologies. His current research focus is also focused on other dangerous conspiracy theories, accelerationism, gaming and radicalizations, adversarial AI, and in general, the nexus of violent extremism and foreign interference and technology. And he's also a senior research fellow at the Accelerationism Research Consortium. And today he's going to be speaking to us about QAnon. He's going to offer a presentation and examination of the movement by examining its history and how it evolved. So from the stage one, framing QAnon as a lived religion and demonstrating that it went through 3 stages. He'll also highlight how QAnon over time evolved into something more than a conspiracy theory, akin to a religious movement. Then he'll talk about the role of gender and women in the QAnon movement. And also it'll be followed by an examination how QAnon conspiracy theories have been legitimized and coordinated and targeted gender-based violence. And then finally, he'll provide evidence around the nexus of QAnon and ideologically motivated violent extremism and criminality. And I think this presentation is particularly relevant, not only because QAnon is relevant to the threat environment in which many of us examine, but also because it delves into questions around the role of religiosity and ideology and the nexus between religious motivations and ideological motivations. So I, for one, am very keen and excited to hear this presentation. Just a bit of housekeeping before I turn it over to Marc-André. So I want to make sure we have ample enough time for his presentation. He'll begin by offering us his remarks. We'll have time set aside for Q&A after that. If you have a question, please put it in the Q&A where we will go through it during the Q&A time. And I'll be fielding those questions to Marc-André. And with that, Marc-André, over to you, and thank you so much.
Are we good? I think so. All right. Good morning and good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining me this morning. Thank you, Lydia, for that very kind and amazing introduction. So I'm going to get straight into it because I am very much looking forward to answering questions for you all on this topic. So let's go down the rabbit hole and examine what is the QAnon movement. So I'm just going to start with a 101 on the QAnon movement. QAnon is not monolithic. It is very much an amalgamation of virtually every popular conspiracy theory that's been put under a single interpretive frame. QAnon hasn't created anything new. Rather, it's what Michael Barkun called a super conspiracy. So it's conspiratorial constructs that are layered together and linked in a type of hierarchy. However, there are 4 core principles to the QAnon movement. These sit at the top, and then the other mainstream conspiracy theories or popular conspiracy theories kind of latch onto it. So the 4 core beliefs to QAnon are: 1, QAnon believes the world is controlled by a coalition of global satanic pedophilic elites who abuse children to collect a substance they called adrenochrome. This could keep them young forever. It could give them super intelligence. It's used in very different ways depending on how you want to cut it, but they're trying to collect this substance through children. Second, they believe that an anonymous user was posting military intelligence and government secrets on 4chan, and that adherents need to decode to help awaken people to the threat the world faces. So QAnon adherents have to participate in a digital war against the deep state in order to save the world. This is a key component, is that really the movement focuses on the digital dimension. The individual known as Q who posts on 4chan, H8kun, never had a call for violence. Rather, the movement and the conspiracy theories are encroachment language, but it's the participation in a digital war that I'll talk a bit more about later that is key to understanding behaviors of adherents. And finally, a great awakening has taken place and millions of people are aware of the crimes and corruptions of these elites. And the QAnon adherents are called to be the calm before the storm. Their job is to awaken people to the reality and, spread the message. It's really about information manipulation and sharing propaganda. Also, QAnon not being a monolithic movement, it's also something that needs to be understood in time and space. One of the challenges in the research I did for my dissertation on this topic is the speed at which QAnon evolved, especially as the pandemic grew and shifted our landscape globally. The movement was changing rapidly with every new conspiracy theory that was popping out. So when we're thinking about QAnon or we're dealing with individuals who have radicalized into QAnon, it's important to contextualize them within a specific time period. The 3 of them are what I call proto-QAnon, canonical QAnon, apocryphal QAnon. I'm not hiding that I'm a religious scholar by training either, using these terms, but it's intentional. So proto-QAnon refers to the fact that QAnon was not born out of nothing, and it has several foundations, but the 3 most important ones are the 2016 Pizzagate conspiracy theory, where people believe that out of the Hillary leaks, email leaks, there was coded messages that were hiding the fact that, all the Democrats were ordering a lot of pizza from this pizza shop, and that was a hidden coded message that pedophiles used to traffic children. That led to one individual going to a DC pizza shop with an AR-15 to liberate the kids in the basement. Surprise when he got there, no basement, no kids. That conspiracy theory obviously died, kind of, and it out of its ashes is where QAnon was born. The other important element for proto-QAnon is the anon genre of LARPing, so live action role playing online. It is common within Chan culture and image boards to play a role of a government official, someone from the intelligence community, from the military, even a time traveler, to share secrets and information in these spaces that others have to decode. There is this LARPing culture that exists. So QAnon, the poster of Q or QAnon didn't even invent this as something new. Rather, it's something that people in this space were familiar with and had knowledge of. So it's not new to them. The final one are what a colleague of mine who goes by Q Origins on Twitter called the lost Q drops. So as we're going to see in a second, canonical drops are all aggregated and decided to as part of the community that they're part of the canon. So the lost Q drops are those that were excluded from aggregators, not considered to be part of the canon of Q drops. But what Q Origins found was that the accounts pretending to be Q early on were throwing spaghetti at the wall and posting several things that never made into the aggregator because, again, the movement at that time was nascent. It wasn't even formalized in a way that they were collecting these drops and following them. So looking at the early posting gives an idea of early behaviors and growth of the movement. In the radicalization angle for this, not as important, but it provides key grounds to understand where the movement comes from and its evolution. Now, canonical QAnon is more the significant point in order to explain the belief system of the movement. So the canonical QAnon refers to the 4,953 posts that was done by the individual going by the moniker Q. These were posted between October 2017 and December 2020. These are referred to as canonical because they're the drops that are accepted as genuine by the community, by influencers. They were included into the official Q aggregators. When Q shifted to 4chan, 8chan, and 8kun, these posts were also ported over with them. So they formed the core scripture, quote unquote, of the QAnon movement that influencers and adherents regularly refer to as a way of trying to distill meaning in the real world at the present time. Now, if anyone follows QAnon still now, there are still Q drops that are happening to this day. However, these are, I'm very much convinced, as with others, that this is just Jim Watkins posting drops on 8kun as a way to generate traffic to a site. I wouldn't consider canonical. I wouldn't even consider them, real. And most QAnon believers and influencers don't even believe in them themselves. Apocryphal QAnon refers to the period now. So this is the period after Q, after Donald Trump lost the election, after the January 6th insurrection. This is the volatile period that we're still in for the QAnon movement due to the loss of influencers, leaders, as well as the early scramble in 2021 to find a new home, as QAnon and many other actors were deplatformed from Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, you name it. And they've made their homes on Truth Social, Telegram, Gab, a whole source of other websites. Though those are the four main ones. So when we're thinking about an individual who's radicalized into QAnon, it's important to understand what period, and even within that period, there's a difference between the structure and behaviors of a QAnon believer in, let's say, April 2020, after the borders were going down and a prime time for COVID conspiracy theories, and one that was, within the movement, let's say in September, ahead of the US election, all in 2020. So all of these things kind of shifted how people believe in behavior. So it's important to contextualize an individual within the period they were believing in the movement. Another key element is that ideological adherence is obtained through participation. This is what I mean by QAnon, or I'm going to talk about as QAnon as a liberal religion. There's two key concepts, is that of digital war and digital soldiers. So a core tenet of QAnon is that Q is a military intelligence operative, and he was helping Donald Trump to fight the deep state in a both digital and kinetic war. So where the military and Trump were going to tackle the physical conflict, Q was playing an important role in the information war against the deep state. There's also a concept behind the Q drops that the deep state is watching everything and knows everything about Q and Trump. So the idea of posting these cryptic messages on 4chan, 8chan, and 8kun is a way to avoid the detection of the deep state's intelligence, so that the Anons were able to decode them and find the meaning to dictate what they had to do. Q also promotes the dissemination and amplification of memes and disinformation. He calls this several times in different posts digital ammo that individuals need to fire to spread and defeat, the deep state that controlled the mainstream media, social media, and all that type of stuff. So as part of the conflict, adherents are already primed to want to spread disinformation. And this is why they're called digital soldiers. QAnon adherents are called by Q and influencers digital soldiers from the get-go. And they're there to, decode the military secrets on QAnon, share on Q drops, share them on Twitter and Facebook, and make YouTube videos, create memes, and create a boatload of propaganda. And even on the Q research board on the chans, there were links on how to red pill people, how to radicalize them, what is the best time to post on social media to get the most views, how to make memes. Here are some, shared mega links with folders of images to use for memes, and even developing A/B testing models of memes on the Q research board to figure out what would be more effective online. So when you're doing, this is important from, I'm going to put my quantitative researcher hat for a second. So when you're looking at online human behavior, if there would be an agreed upon baseline on what a normal human posts or behaves like online, it's important to highlight that a QAnon believer would surpass that baseline, basically because they are primed to be a digital soldier in a digital war. So their job and their role as an adherent is to promote this information and share it. This is how you become a member of the QAnon movement. There's no ritual or anything. It's by participation. You need to decode, you need to share memes, you need to communicate with others in the space. So when I was looking at these individuals online, you could see that their digital behaviors are already hyperactive in comparison to a normal individual. So it's important to demystify when studies go about, oh, there's a lot of bots in QAnon. It actually requires both a quantitative and qualitative evaluation to understand that actually these are humans that are just really engaged in this conversation and this ideology. So because you're a digital soldier in a digital war, I started looking at QAnon as a lived tradition. Again, there is no initiation. There's no baptism. There's no real sacred text, though we have Q drops. There's no, physical building to go to. There's no real influencer. Q is not, a god in this space. He acts more as an oracle giving information. Donald Trump himself was more of a prophet than anything else. It comes down to the individual influencers to dictate the behaviors of the communities they're in. So to that end, I found that there were 3 forms of religious practice in QAnon. So these are entangled religious practices. So these are practices that occur when there's a high degree of overlap between religion and everyday social action that extends across a broad swath of society. This is what I've called QAnon as a hyper-real religion. I'll cover that in a second. There's established religious traditions. So this is what we see when QAnon mixes with Christianity more often than not. And we see in particular, conservative evangelicals, dominionism, New Apostolic Reformation. We'll see a lot of the overlap between that space. And even in one case, I found a congregation that was teaching both QAnon and dominionism as part of their weekly service. Finally, there's interstitial practices. And this is really for the purpose of my research to refer to the rise of those who identify as spiritual rather than religious. So those are, this is a broad swath of potential beliefs in QAnon. So, you could have those yoga practitioners, tarot reading, beliefs in angels, healing power of the crystal, speaking to spirits, burning sage, the whole 9 yards. It runs the gamut. And this is also what's called as conspirituality. Matthew Remski, I think Remski is his last name, has a book coming out in June. I currently have a digital copy of it and I've enjoyed reading it. I'll really recommend it, but he covers this very well. So we could see that there's, as broad as QAnon is an ideology, its practices are also very broad. So I'm just going to cover the first one, which is QAnon as a hyper-real religion. So hyper-real religion is a term coined by sociologist Adam Possamai to basically describe the concept rooted in Jean Baudrillard's work on hyper-reality. So it's based on the premise that pop culture shapes and creates our actual reality. Some popular examples: Matrixism, Church of All Worlds, Jediism. So you could see that pop culture shapes how people believe within these spaces, but as a movement in constant state of mutation, QAnon blurs the boundaries between popular culture and everyday life. Q drops rely and reference movies as a way of making meaning. The slogan, "Where we go one, we go all," is from White Squall. And we could see that the YouTube video for White Squall, which had tens of thousands of views before the movement started, has millions of views from QAnon believers and comments from these individuals going to comment on the video as a type of significant reference to their ideological belief. David Chidester, in his book on religion and popular culture, also argued that popular culture doesn't only permeate religion, but popular culture essentially embodies the characteristics and roles of faith by their mutual mimetic play and method. Now, when I mean that QAnon's a hyper-real religion, I don't mean that there is a church or a physical building, but it's the interplay between the digital environments and cultures from which it emerged that dictates the behavior of the adherents. Now, if we look at established religions, an example is the church, what I call the Church of QAnon. They're actually called the Omega Kingdom Ministry. I spent a year going to their virtual church services during the pandemic. They had called these Equipping the Ecclesia. They were live streamed 2-hour sessions every Sunday. And the first 10 sessions were actually founded on the QAnon documentary Fall Cabal. They broke the documentary down into 10 parts. Before every service, participants had to watch the documentary as well as the weekly readings for the church. And what they did, they were combining it with dominionism, which is a theology that believes countries, including the US and others, should be governed by Christian biblical law. And in their case, QAnon. They had overseas headquarters in Australia, Cambodia, Canada, United Kingdom, Germany, and Japan. So this is not something that was limited to the UK, but rather this congregation had several bases across the globe. And what we saw is that the combination of QAnon and religion provided a radicalization roadmap that, that not only can include digital assets, but combined it with established religious beliefs and practices that were used to explain conspiracy theories that could seem dubious at times for adherents. In the interstitial practices is part of my research was on what I have called pastel QAnon. Pastel QAnon was a cheeky name I came up with for the Instagram influencers that use Canva templates to make, beautiful Instagram posts that were hiding QAnon conspiracy theories, anti-Semitism, hate speech, and everything else under the sun. What I do want to show on the screen, though, is if you look on the right, you'll see what you would find on, memes on 4chan, 8chan, 8kun. It's not very attractive. It's very confusing. If you're not within the milieu, this looks very weird. But if you look at the way that they branded and created an aesthetic for QAnon within the pastel QAnon space on Instagram, you saw that they normalized it within the branding and aesthetics that these QAnon influencers had on Instagram. And they didn't start as QAnon influencers, rather they started as, mommy bloggers, yoga instructors, fitness influencers. But what happened was in the summer of 2020, when QAnon was initially deplatformed by YouTube and Facebook, they decided to react and hijack a left-leaning hashtag, which in July is Save the Children, which is Child Trafficking Awareness Month. They took over that hashtag, and it led to a lot of these influencers to discover Out of Shadows, Fall Cabal, QAnon influencers, and it created this perfect storm of, conspirituality. Very popular, very rapid growing. And it was a way to soften the image of QAnon and coat it with a veneer of we're here to prevent child trafficking, which was very attractive and gave it a base to go viral. Now, it's important to highlight that QAnon both gives and takes power away from women. What I mean by this is that women in QAnon are more than social media influencers, and in some instances, they're players in the political arena. We have two women who attain public office, Marjorie Taylor Greene and Lauren Boebert. Both were able to campaign partially on the QAnon platform initially. They distanced themselves, obviously, as they won their seats in good political fashion. But we could see, based on their behaviors and their statements and past social media, they were within the movement and believed the content there. But it's important to highlight that using these beliefs, they are actually having an impact to erode away democratic institutions and processes. There are several types of harm in QAnon that are not limited to violent extremism in QAnon, and eroding trust in democratic institutions is one of them. We also saw someone like Sidney Powell, who was the former lawyer for Donald Trump, very notable woman of QAnon in the political scene, especially after January 6th. She played a key role in, promoting the big lie conspiracy theory, the fact that the election was stolen. She did a lot of the litigation for Donald Trump in the courts, and QAnon believers believe that she was playing a key role in fighting the deep state. And it shot her to a meteoric rise in QAnon spaces, even on Telegram, where she had at one point 872,000 followers on a Telegram channel, which was irking longtime established QAnon influencers. Now, as part of this, what I did was with ISD, we did a study on gender-based violence and QAnon to get an idea of how QAnon targets women in positions of power. However, when we were doing the study, it was just ahead of the US election, and we didn't want to bias the result by looking at elected officials. So what we did was look at individuals in the media industry that were part of the QAnon conspiracy theory, and then also look at similar individuals to provide a comparison and contrast. So what I mean by this was, let's say we took Chrissy Teigen and Tom Hanks, both of which were very prominent in the QAnon space and received a lot of abuse as actors. We took Ellen DeGeneres and Anderson Cooper to represent the LGBTQ community, and we took UC Smollett and Oprah Winfrey to represent the African American community. And the idea we wanted to find out was, is QAnon's harassment of identity groups and individuals in position of power similar to existing studies on the topic, or is there something different about the way that they targeted and harassed individuals? And one of the key features that we found was that harassment within the QAnon space actually increased for these identity groups based on the reference to them being pedophiles linked to the QAnon conspiracy theory rather than their vulnerable identities. So as soon as they were labeled as a pedophile and part of the conspiracy with the deep state, we saw that the digital soldiers of the QAnon movement would target these individuals heavily. Even for Chrissy Teigen, she had to close down some of her social media accounts for a while because of this type of harassment. Now, another dimension of QAnon is violent extremism and criminality, something that is difficult to avoid. However, it's important to realize that the threat from QAnon doesn't necessarily fit within the traditional terrorism label, and there is a spectrum of threats that we're going to see that falls within the violent extremism label all the way down to petty criminality. So threw on a bunch of data on the screen. Happy to share these if anyone wants them. But if we just look at the incidents per year, hopefully you can see this on the screen. So the incidents per year on the top right, we could see that up until the pandemic, there wasn't much criminality or violent extremism within the QAnon movement. The pandemic played an important role in accelerating the radicalization and mobilization process of individuals. There are obvious explanations as to why this happened. It correlates with other incidents that we've seen. But the anxiety and the conspiracy theories around the movement really led to a meteoric rise of QAnon, especially as in 2019, the movement was almost dead. 8chan was shut down because of the incidents in Christchurch. So Q had lost its home. When 8kun came up in November of 2019, it did not gain the traction it has. It wasn't until all the conspiracy theories from the pandemic that came forth that led to the meteoric rise of the movement. So we could see that 2020 had an increase from 8 to 43. 2021, if we look on the bottom, we can see that there's 109 incidents that are linked to January 6th, 51 to non-J6 events. However, I do want to highlight that 109 individuals out of 1,000 arrested and prosecuted for January 6th means that QAnon represents 11% of all individuals arrested for their participation in January 6th, which is significant. We could also see that US, Canada, Netherlands, and Australia are the top 4 countries in terms of individuals arrested for QAnon, violent extremism, and criminality. That will change. I have a list of 75 cases out of Germany that I have not accounted for yet, as I am slacking a bit in my work right now. But this would mean that if we add the January 6th incidents, Germany comes in second behind the United States in terms of violent extremism and criminality related to QAnon. We could also see, looking at the bottom left here, that a lot of the transnational violent extremism and criminality, again, happened after the pandemic. So we could see that the COVID-19 pandemic played a role in not only increasing violent extremism and criminality within the QAnon movement, but also making it transnational in light of the shared conspiracy theories and grievances on a global scale. Now, this doesn't mean that QAnon didn't exist in other countries before the pandemic. That's not true. I found QAnon in 85 different countries over the years. It just means that the movements were not prone to mobilize offline. It was really much this digital soldier aspect. It's important to highlight that the majority of QAnon incidents were actually violent. So 179 out of 246 Dojo 47 were linked to, had a violent dimension to them, 58 did not. We could see again that violent action increased in 2020, 21, 2022. From a gender perspective, 184 were identifying as male, 58 identified as female. 4 I was not able to identify due to some countries not giving out the entire name or gender of individuals arrested for crimes. And of interest, we could also see the age dynamic, and where the average age in the PIRES database coming out of the STAR Consortium would indicate that an offender for far-right ideologies falls within the age of 35.3, 5.4. The average age of a QAnon believer who's been arrested for a crime is actually 44. But we could see also that they tend to be generally in their 30s to 60s, and honestly, we're talking late 30s more often than not. Who are the targets of QAnon violence? If we look at, oh, this is the same slide. Well, if we look at the targets of QAnon violence, I'm going to do this without fixing it then. So the targets of QAnon violence when we were looking at the data would be that the highest crime is actually kidnapping. So we're looking at 16 instances of individuals who kidnap their own children, either from Child Protective Services, another guardian, or a ward of the state. All 16 kidnappings were actually committed by women. And we also saw that all those who did the kidnappings had an overlap with the pseudo law movement. So your sovereign citizens, freedom on the land, freedom on the land, and yeah, anyways, the pseudo law movement. Also, we saw that there are 7 crimes that are related to terrorism, so it's either inciting an act of terrorism or making terroristic threats, but there are actually 2 charges of terrorism. One of them was for derailing a train in San Francisco, and the other one was for the individual who held up the Hoover Dam in 2018 with an armored truck and explosives. We could see that a lot of the crimes are perpetrated against the state. So it's government officials, law enforcement. Then we see the second highest level is related to people that they know, friends, family are the second group of victims. After that, there's a sharp drop. You'll see them going after health professionals, teachers, scientists, researchers, and the gamma kind of goes everywhere. Right. Keeping an eye on time because I do want to do some Q&A. I'm just going to quickly go through QAnon post January 6th. And there's 3 key trends that I've seen since J6 that have shaped and shifted the QAnon movement. First, it's platform migration. Obviously, with the deplatforming of QAnon, we saw the shift away from mainstream platforms to the plethora of, adversarial sites that we have to accept now that there is an established and stable adversarial social media system for actors that have been deplatformed. So Gab, Odyssey, Telegram, MeWe, Truth Social, your BitChute, your World Truth videos. There is a plethora of places for these individuals, and they have congregated on all these platforms. So we could see that there's a shift. What was interesting about that shift is how QAnon then combined with some of the new ideologies there. You could see QAnon slowly becoming, or some QAnon influencers becoming more involved in National Socialism, increase in, beliefs with militias or uttering terroristic threats as they were combining with this. Some cases with individuals that I've talked to about their family members were, I had an aunt who was a conspiracy theorist, went into QAnon, but after January 6th, when she came for the holidays, she was talking about this text she never heard of called the Elders Protocols of Zion. And she thought it was something that was being censored by the media. It was this massive reveal about how the Jews were controlling the world. So you could see that the niche nature of the content found on places like Gab and Telegram was fodder for QAnon believers, as there's a tangential link to what they already believed. But because it was found on these adversarial sites and not on mainstream platforms, they believe it's something that was being censored by the deep state, leading them to want to consume this media more. So this is where we saw the symbiosis and mutation, with QAnon influencers moving a little bit away from QAnon in some cases towards more violent extremist ideologies. We also saw the rise of what I'm calling neo-QAnon influencers. So your Sidney Powells, which kind of fallen out of favor, But if we look at this cute little dude on the right with the red eyes, he goes by the name Kinakoa the Great. And you may see him if you're on Twitter talking with Elon Musk, who Musk subscribes to his Twitter page. They interact with each other regularly. So you can see that some of these individuals have a level of influence and engagement at some of the highest levels of either owners of social media platforms or in politics. We also have on the bottom here, -48, or Michael Protzman. He runs a group of individuals who believe that JFK Jr. will be coming back to life, and they're waiting for him in Texas. Obviously, the lady in purple is the lovely Queen of Canada. Romana Didulo amassed a major amount of followings in Canada. Most recently, she was made famous in the news for having some of her followers try to do a citizen's arrest of law enforcement officers in Peterborough. That went terribly for them. But we could see the type of influence and impact that they have within these spaces right now. And there is a variety of the influence that these individuals could have. And I will end it there to be on time and hopefully it has the capacity to answer questions.
Thank you so much, Marc-André. That was a terrific presentation. As someone who's followed QAnon myself, I learned a lot from that and had just a number of new insights from your framing and conceptualization of the movement and how you laid it out in a linear fashion for us. So that was really terrific. Just want to remind people that if you have any questions, to please put them in the Q&A chat and I can get to your questions for Marc-André then. I'm wondering though if I could just take moderator's privilege and ask you a couple of questions from your presentation. So one of them that came to mind was, and you referred a little bit to this at the end through the reference to the Protocols of Elders of Zion. You spoke about how QAnon is not necessarily an original conspiracy theory, but it's a modern manifestation of older conspiracy beliefs. And it's, it clearly has references not only just to the Pizzagate conspiracy theory that you spoke about, but perhaps even to older ones like the Satanic Panic theories and thoughts in the 70s and 80s, but even older to blood libel conspiracy theories as well, which kind of brings me to the question about the role of anti-Semitism plays in the movement. Can you talk about what anti-Semitism mean, how it manifests through the movement, how the conspiracies kind of intersect with that?
So it's the simple way to put it is that QAnon at its core is anti-Semitic. The entire trope of collecting adrenochrome is founded on different types of, anti-Semitic conspiracies, whether it's blood libel or whatever else you want to really name it. It's there. Even the fact, like the whole deep state concept falls within this anti-Semitic trope that Jews control the media and the government. And we could see that in the type of targets that they tend to select initially, going after George Soros, the anti-Semitic tropes there. It's part and parcel of the conspiracy theory. It's not explicit in the Q drops. However, it is insinuated by the type of conduct. Even if you're looking at, some of the more niche UFO, reptilian, hollow earth conspiracy theories, the majority of them have a root within anti-Semitic beliefs and practices. And that is acerbated depending on the influencer that promotes the conspiracy theory. These influencers are the ones that really impact QAnon believers and behaviors because the group around them will follow their lead. So those that are more anti-Semitic will be able to tease that out from the Q drops. And that's the reason I look at it in a way as a new religious movement is the canonical relationship they have with Q drops and the way that they're able to reinterpret it to find meaning is how they're able to develop these anti-Semitic tropes as well as justifications for their behaviors. Because for them, it's not that they don't see it as anti-Semitic, they don't see it as harassment. What they see and believe is that what they are doing is a service to the country. They are there to liberate people from the deep state. So they become the heroes of their own narratives by fighting the Jews controlling the media and the government, by targeting pedophiles, by targeting individuals they think are in cahoots with the deep state. So when we're seeing the anti-Semitic tropes, it goes in there. And we could even see in some of the crimes that they had when, they vandalized or burned synagogues or gone after, targeted Jewish people of influence.
Thanks, Mark. So we have a couple of questions about QAnon's links to overseas actors and groups. So one question is specifically around its linkages in Australia specifically, and how embedded QAnon is in Australia. And then there's another specific question about QAnon links with overseas actor groups like the Internet research agencies. So can you answer a bit about that? About the links and manifestations abroad, particularly in Australia?
So for the link to, I'll do the one with the IRA because that's going to be the quicker / easier one. For those who are not aware, my day job is that of a public servant for the government of Canada. My former job, now I work at public safety, which is, we just had Lydia, an amazing conference in Canada. But part of my job before that was actually working on foreign interference and studying the impact that it has on Canadian elections, as well as our allies. Research, can't talk about the research I did in the government, but part of the research that I found was I had no evidence where I would be comfortable to justify and say that there is a link that goes directly to any hostile state actor. There has been some studies that have come out. Graphica did a really good study. Melanie Smith did that there. She's not ISD, but what she found was about 2% of all QAnon posts at some point in 2020 had a tangential link or contained or were amplified by individuals related to hostile state actors. The reality is something like QAnon rather acts as in two ways. One, you might have hostile state actors create propaganda or narratives that'll be attractive to an audience and have QAnon adherents amplify it as useful idiots. Or you might have, it'll weaken the resolve of individuals and have them trust media from hostile state actors because of this coalescence or the similarity it has with their conspiratorial beliefs, as well as the fact that, QAnon perceives the US or Australia or Canada as being controlled by the deep state. They're corrupt. So they'll see someone that, democratic nations will criticize, like, Russia, China, or any hostile state actor. They'll be like, oh, well, these are actually the good guys because we have the similar mandate. So there is an overlap. There is a relationship, but I haven't seen any evidence, and I don't think anyone has provided any real evidence to say there's a real link directly related to hostile state actors. So it doesn't mean that there's no role, there's no tangential link, or it can't weaken people's resolves, but I wouldn't go to be like, yeah, this is a Russian operation. As in terms of Australia, well, you have a pretty healthy QAnon community in Australia. I also believe at one point someone who was close to your prime minister was a key QAnon influencer. I don't know if this is Australia or New Zealand, so I'm sorry if I'm confusing. Former prime minister, but I also don't know if it's Australia or New Zealand, but you also had a clinical psychologist who was also an instructor who lost his license to practice because of promoting QAnon conspiracy theories, as well as teaching to his clients, but also teaching them in class. So I don't know if that's Australia or New Zealand, so I apologize if I'm confusing you with your neighbors. But there is a healthy community and even some unique QAnon conspiracy theories. I remember in end of 2020, early 2021, you had a couple of earthquakes, like they were like 2.0s, 3.0s, but QAnon loved to follow earthquake maps. And the reason for that is they were relating that to a military operation by the US military and the Australian military to get rid of DUMBs, so deep underground military bases. And the earthquakes were evidence of them going underground to liberate, children from the deep state. So they're able to create these very unique conspiracy, looking at, oh, well, we saw on the trains, or we saw the movement of Australian military personnel going in this region. It matches up with the earthquake. So they're able to tailor it to the construct. Now, I don't think that it's as big as we see in the US. Australia is probably more similar to what we see in Canada. So you do have that influence. Luckily, you don't have Queen Romana in your, in your borders, but you do see that. And it's more also that, Australia, like many countries, has a healthy conspiracy theory community, and QAnon as the one that generates the most view and traction is just something that, a true believer or a grifter is going to use as a way of generating views and revenues.
Thanks, Mark. I think that also answered another question about any specific Australian themes emerging in QAnon as well. So thanks for that. We have a couple of questions around disruption and intervention. So we have one question around, given the role of participation and immersion online, what can we do then to kind of reverse these beliefs, the way that the questioner puts it, or more generally, what would you consider to be the best method of disruption or intervention, if that's even possible, or is it something that's kind of futile, as kind of conspiracy belief will also exist? I suppose another way to frame it as well is, what psychosocial need is this movement fulfilling for people? And in understanding that, can we perhaps come up with methods of intervention and disruption for practitioners working in this space?
So there's definitely ways to, in terms of prevention and for like psychosocial support. I didn't include it in the presentation, but one of the key elements of my research was, why do people believe in QAnon? It's out there, right? What I found was it acts in a way, I'll go back to my religious terms, but theodicy. It explains the problem of evil. It provides a black and white answer to very gray, difficult questions. Why is there child trafficking, and why is the government not doing anything about it? It's not that we're not doing anything about it, but there is a very complex set of socio-political and environmental factors that lead to child trafficking. That is not something that you could just wipe off the earth and eliminate. There are challenges there. Same thing. Why is there war? Why was there a global pandemic? To give a monolithic evil force that is controlling and dictating these behaviors, it does offer comfort to people. And when we see some of those who, like in interviews of those who have been arrested and kind of like dropped their beliefs in QAnon, they tend to say that this was providing an answer to some scenarios or explanations I need. Why did I lose my job? Why am I locked in? Am I alone? Why were my kids taken away from me? So there is an inherent need. I don't think there's much of a difference from a psychosocial clinician perspective in dealing with, a QAnon believer versus a violent extremist. In the sense, there are some similar individual needs that are there. In terms of interventions, I think one of the key gaps, and this is something that I have a publication that's under review right now for this, but one of the needs is support for friends and families. There is a very sad, but I think important community on Reddit called QAnon Casualties, where you see friends and family come together to talk about the trauma and the challenges they face in terms of dealing with their family member. And you could see some of the challenges they face, that they don't, they tried to do debunks, and someone even recently was, I think 2 days ago, was posted about, I wrote an 81-page document debunking all their beliefs. It didn't work. Or, some of the saying it was after they lost a job or after X happened. So you could see that some of the trigger pains and pressure points are all there. It's the challenge is kind of getting them the help they need and having them willing to participate. I know in times where, at least in the Canadian context, if we have a client, an at-risk client who's recommended by law enforcement or whatever, they might be more willing to do that. But in terms of a QAnon believer, the majority of these people are not criminals. They're not violent. So it's hard for them to get the help they need if they're not willing to go and find it. I think there's a lot of tools we could do in terms of civic education, providing support, giving tools for people on how to talk with them. One of the key issues I found when I'm talking with some QAnon believers is they tend to feel alone and be alone because parents, friends, family, or spouses are sick and tired of dealing with them. They don't know how to communicate with them. So I don't think there's a good toolkit right now to support friends and family members to how to deal with this. What are the resources available to them? I know that's something that a couple of organizations in Canada are working with, to be like resources for this. So what is there within the Australian context, within the Australian networks, that there are as tools and resources to, raise awareness to family members, that they could be like, hey, if you have someone who believes in this, here are some, clinicians, social workers, some tools that you could use. That's some of the challenges that are there. Again, it's finding the resource and getting them to the right people at the right time.
So you mentioned that the majority of QAnon believers are not necessarily violent, but we do have a number of questions relating to violence that QAnon has wrought. So one of them refers to kind of the graphs that you had where the violence seemed to peak in 2021. And the question revolves around whether you see this peak as a reflection on the overlap with the pandemic and COVID conspiracy theories related to lockdowns and government control of people movements? And was this this peak very specific to the pandemic? And can we now anticipate that violence from QAnon might be on the downward trajectory? And then other questions frame it in the opposite way. Is there an increased tension for physical violence now on a greater scale rather than digital manifestation? So I guess all of these questions are relating for QAnon, the QAnon movements and adherents of the QAnon movement's potential for violence, and whether that peak was pandemic specific.
So the pandemic definitely played a role in QAnon. I can't deny that. If it wasn't for the pandemic, I honestly think the movement would likely have disappeared within 2020. Like I was saying, 8kun, whatever, like all of that kind of changed in a way how the movement was perceived. Is there a downward trajectory? Yes. In 2022, I saw that the numbers had gone down. So, we're probably going to see that, but I think the potential for violence and radicalization is still there. Again, these are individuals that are primed for action, and they believe right now their solution is that in digital wars, sharing content. But if they lose that capacity, they lose that power, they are willing to mobilize offline. And that's what I've seen. And those who mobilize offline tend to do so quickly. Some instances, I saw one woman, she radicalized in 9 days, at another man who radicalized in 3. Most of them radicalized in less than half a year, like radicalization to mobilization offline. You have some who've been there for years and are never going to mobilize. So I don't think we're going to see a rise anymore, but I do think that there is still a potential there. So it's not to diminish the possibility. I think the biggest harms really comes to friends and family and democratic institutions. Those are the two bigger threats, which again, it's a different type of violence. Again, I'm going back to like QAnon casualties, divorces, abandoned children. That type of harm, that type of trauma in the long run could lead to other instances. And if it's not QAnon, you could see those are vulnerabilities that could lead to violent actions based on other grievances and motivations. So there's still individuals who need help. And at this time, as soon as they lose the ideological support to explain, again, they're explaining the problem of evil to them. If you have no solution, it really is, then we're going to see that. So I don't think we're going to see the height we saw in J6. Who knows what's going to happen in 2024 in the US, depending on who's running for office. But I think there's still a potential. I mean, QAnon believer attacked Nancy Pelosi's husband with a hammer recently. We still had father who shot his daughter in the back with a shotgun. In comparison to, attacks against African Americans, anti-Semitism, attacks against the power grids, other threat actors, QAnon is not a massive threat in that same spectrum. The type of harm and violence is very different, and that's something to keep in mind. But I think volume-wise, there's a potential for a higher volume of at-risk clients than you do have with other ideologies and movements.
So that relates to another question that was asked. Some of these instances of violence by QAnon believers that you referenced also coincided with these individuals having some sort of mental health issue. So do you have any statistics or any visibility on QAnon members with mental health issues, or what role does mental health play in either the draw to this movement or the potential for future violence of people with mental health issues who get ensnared in the QAnon conspiracy?
So the mental health challenge is a difficult one because a lot of the cases where mental health is associated to the incident is self-diagnosed or portrayed by the media. There are, in the US, I was able through PACER to get most of the cases. There is a fair amount that have diagnosed professionally mental health issues. But again, how many of these people have anxiety, PTSD, everything else that's properly diagnosed or self-diagnosed? It's hard to tell. So I don't have the data to confirm it. I haven't seen anyone actually do the type of interview studies with individuals who have committed acts of criminality to get that information. So it's something that is possible, but I don't know how much that would differ within QAnon than you'd see with, let's say, other violent extremists or terrorist actors.
So bringing it back to the political a bit, there was an early question around the relationship between QAnon and this articulation of pedophilia accusations and the backlash politics of white grievance. And if, the question asks, a frequency count of key terms in QAnon's canonical posts suggest that this pedophilia accusations is actually like a political response that deals with kind of grievances or reactionary politics of white nationalism. Do you have any thoughts about that?
So yes and no, in the sense that the way that the meta politics around pedophilia being leveraged by white nationalists now in terms of the transgender community is similar but different to what we're seeing in QAnon, in the sense that for QAnon, it's not a meta political strategy. And at the time where I did the study, though QAnon loved trying to find penises on Michelle Obama, Hillary Clinton, and whoever else to identify it, it wasn't in the same way that we're seeing now. The pedophilia label really is just the one core, as a core tenet of QAnon, that, the people who are part of the deep state, their key actors, are abusing children. They are trafficking children. That's the label that they're putting together. The risk with that, and a lot of, I think 9 or 10 QAnon adherents, at least that I know of, were arrested on pedophilia charges, either because they were child predators or because Q made them go look for pedophilia and they were going into spaces where they were selling child exploitation material. So it's similar but distinct than what we're seeing right now in the case of how, the pedophilia label being used against the LGBTQ community by these actors. I think there's a distinction there. It doesn't mean that it's as harmful or there's no link, and QAnon believers definitely now are on that meta political bandwagon. But that's also because the conversation around, transgenderism has this spectrum from mainstream political legislations all the way down to white supremacist ideological beliefs, and they're just on a similar platform right now because they kind of agree. And threat actors are using that political platform or popular culture icons, leveraging anti-trans rhetoric as a way of normalizing their own discourses.
So we're coming close to time, and there's many questions in the post, and apologies to everyone whose questions I was not able to get to. But I think I'll just end it with the last one that I saw coming in, which is around the cohort. So the question asks, traditionally radicalization risk is more, in the younger ages, from like, say, teenage years to up to the early 30s. With this group, the risk of radicalization seems to be in an older cohort. And the question is why? Why with this group is the risk of radicalization at an older age level?
I don't think I have a satisfactory answer. Part of it, however, is the conspiracy theories that QAnon believers believe in are intrinsically linked to beliefs that an older generation would have. So a lot of it's a boomer conspiracy theory, in a sense that, like the Black Hawk helicopters, the deep state, lizard people, hollow earth, a lot of these are conspiracy theories, even ufology, that were popularized in, the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. The younger generation latch onto a different type of conspiracy theories and disinformation, which are not necessarily popularized within QAnon. It doesn't mean that you don't have young people in QAnon. It's just not necessarily what they're interested in, I find, from, the content. It's also the fact that because this is a movement that tends to age older, it's not something that they're going to find within digital context. They're not going to have the same type of relationships and networks as they would with their peers. And that's one of the challenges when you're building these networks, is those who mobilize tend to be a little bit older. However, even on the Chan culture, it's hard to distinguish what some of them are. So I know from the criminal space, those mobilizing have, tend to be a little bit older, but I think the age might normalize across a wider swath. I would indicate to wait a couple of months for a study that's coming out of CREST, done by Bettina Rottweiler, Paul Gill, and Amarnatha Marasingham. They're doing surveys in Canada, the US, the UK, France, Germany, I think. And they're actually going to have more data in terms of age and demographics for QAnon believers. Do I have the... Yeah, I don't have Amar's recent presentation for the age, but they're going to have a better idea because they're doing larger surveys to get an idea that could be distinct from those who committed criminal acts.
Well, thank you, Mark, and thank you to all of you who participated with us at this webinar. And again, apologies to everyone where we couldn't get to your questions. I would say that Marc-André has published extensively on this topic, and you can follow him on Twitter, where he often posts about the movement, and you might find many of the answers to your questions in his previously published work. So I'd encourage you to take a look at everything that he's done and written on this. Thank you for your work in illuminating this movement for us and for joining us from your evening across the globe. Please be on the lookout for future announcements around our AVERT webinars in June and in the coming months. Thank you again to all who are joining us. And if you'd like to see a recording of Marc-André's presentation and this webinar, it will be available on our website, avert.net.au. Thank you so much, everyone. And thank you again, Dr. Argentino.
Thank you for having me. Good night or good morning. Cheers.